Good afternoon. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Acton Institute. And on behalf of the Acton Institute, I'm delighted to welcome you all again to the 2022 Poverty Cure Summit. This year, we're doing a hybrid online event. So we have people online from all over the world who are watching, and we also have a live studio audience. So after we'll have some conversation with our panelists, and then we can take questions both from online. You can submit them through chat or here a live audience. So if you have questions as well, we'll have mics to go around. For those of you just joining us, I've talked a little bit about Poverty Cure, and at the center of Poverty Cure's idea is that there's the human person, that the human person is at the center of the economy, and that human persons are not simply gears or machines to be moved around. But oftentimes when we think about poverty, we can tend to objectify poor people. We can turn poor people into objects of our pity, objects of our compassion, objects of our charity, and we can socially engineer them and try to solve their problems instead of treating them like the protagonists of their own story of development. And so these are the themes of Poverty Cure and at the Acton Institute. So I'm delighted to have a panel today. Our final panel of the day is a debate discussion. There'll probably be some discussion, hopefully a good debate as well, between two really fascinating interesting panelists, Chris Arnade and Bryan Caplan. So very brief on their bios. Chris is the author of a book called Dignity. Is it Seeking Respect in Back Row America? Yeah, Seeking Respect in Back Row America. And he'll explain what the difference between the front row kids and the back row kids are. And you're probably front row kids over here. Bryan Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University. Also, Chris has a Substack called Chris Walks the World, where he walks the world. He goes and he spends time walking through cities and meeting people and talking about them. I highly recommend it, Chris Arnade at Substack. And Bryan Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University, original Californian like me. I would give you Bryan Caplan's all the books that he's written, but that would take up our time. So I'll just tell you that some of his latest books include Don't Be a Feminist, The Case Against Education, Labor Econ versus the World, Selfish Reasons to Have More Children, and Why Politicians Are Evil.
How evil are politicians?
How evil
Question
are
mark.
politicians? Yeah. See, so
let's not prejudge things.
Yeah. So he's not provocative in any way, shape, or form. So delighted to have both Chris and Bryan here with us. So why don't we start? One of the things you're working on now, Bryan, is a book called Poverty: Who's to Blame? And the theme of this panel is Who's to Blame for Poverty. So why don't you maybe quickly, since you tend to have these provocative moves, why don't you make an argument? What do you think if we look at the United States today, and we think about poverty in the United States, which is different from poverty in the developing world, who's to blame for poverty? What do you think?
What I say in the book is there's really three things, at least. Of course, probably more than three things. The first thing I talk about is immigration restrictions in the first world, because if you could just leave poor countries and get a job in a rich country, you can almost instantly solve your poverty if you're an able-bodied adult. I talk about bad economic policies, which we see especially in the third world, although also to some extent in the first world. For example, for housing regulation. And then the last one I talk about is irresponsible behavior. This is the one almost everyone wants to keep talking about. So even if I give a talk where it's 95% about bad immigration policy and bad economic policy, the remaining 5% on irresponsible behavior gets almost all the questions. I don't back away from that. But yes, there's been some very common sense research just looking at why people end up poor. And one very strong result is you don't need to be a genius to avoid poverty in America. You don't need to be a superstar. You don't need to go and cure cancer or develop a vaccine or found a business. Really, all you need to do to have a very high probability of avoiding poverty is simply finish high school, get a full-time job, and don't have kids until you're married, and that pretty much solves the problem. This would not be true in poor countries, but in the US, it really does seem to be true.
So, Chris, you in your book, Dignity, you argue that oftentimes and correct me, of course, if I misrepresent you, but that oftentimes the right tends to give the poor too much agency, and the left tends to give the poor not enough agency. And that what you found in your like real life long engagement with people is that there's this tension here that their dignity and their agency is not respected, and nor are the challenges that come to them. So how do you maybe talk about that and perhaps respond to Bryan's
Before
view?
I just want to say, I'd rather have this be a discussion than a debate, because you're probably like the debate champion of your high school.
I wish.
and I was out smoking dope in the parking lot.
Yeah, I wasn't.
But thinking about poverty in the U.S. in particular, is I guess my kind of glib answer is, we are all to blame for poverty, because if we think about poverty in simply an economic framework, we could solve poverty today. We could just give people money and get them above the poverty line, raise taxes on the rich, give people enough money, and we would have solved, quote, the definitional poverty. But I think what we're talking about here is kind of more what you would call dysfunctional behavior. And I guess the way I look at it is I look at everything within the context of, I look at things at a cultural perspective, not so much as an economic perspective. So if I see somebody makes what he would say is irrational, reckless decisions, I ask, why did they do that? And often it's because it's a product of where they grew up. It's a product of not having enough information. It's a product of, if you think of culture as a toolbox that you're given, their toolbox is very different in many cases. People have very different toolboxes, and that's partly the product of where you grow up. If you are in an environment in which reckless decisions are kind of glorified or done often all the time, then you're more inclined to do reckless decisions. If you don't know that there are reckless decisions, you're more inclined to do reckless decisions. But I would also say that there also comes a point when you start to have to ask, why are people making reckless decisions? Because I probably disagree with Bryan in a bit. I think in some senses people are behaving rationally, in the sense that they're maximizing their utility function. They're making a decision which reflects how they view the world. And I view poverty as kind of not an absence of economic value. I think in the U.S. certainly we have a lot of stuff. So people are filled with stuff. What they do not have is a lot of central meaning. They don't have a will to live. They don't have a reason to live. And addiction is the one I think, the one I'm most familiar with, the most reckless decision. Addiction is a form of suicide. And humans are the sole animal that kills himself. And that's a damning thing to do, is to kill yourself. It's a pretty damning statement on how you feel about the world. And the fact that more and more people are killing themselves and willfully ingesting drugs that they know will kill them speaks to that they themselves have an emptiness. They're driven to kind of this reckless behavior by a feeling that they don't have there's no point being here. They're not part of something larger than themselves. So I give people more the benefit of the doubt, because the idea that if you want to understand somebody, walk a mile in their shoes. I certainly haven't walked in their shoes, but I've sat at McDonald's with them for more than an hour. And I generally, there is people, I'm not going to completely dismiss the idea that there's different behavior. There are some people who have very different behavior. But I do think that you have to look at the broader context in which people make their decisions.
Bryan, you want to?
Wow, yeah, sure. I want to say a lot of things.
He was debate champion.
Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, I don't think that it's true that the right tends to assign too much agency and the left too little. I think they both tend to assign much too little. I think especially there's been a move on the right to start assigning less agency. As social pathology has spread to the white population, then suddenly, oh wait, now there's something to this idea that it's society's fault that you are drinking too much and beating your children. It's like, no, like you had it right the first time. It is a beverage. You do not have to put it in your mouth. And furthermore, like sort of the idea that these ideas are alien to communities like this, that's just not true when you read ethnographies of poverty. It is totally standard for parents to be telling their kids, I don't want you to make the same mistakes I made. They are mistakes. The teachers are telling them these are terrible mistakes, don't do it. Look at where it ends up. It ends up in my situation. And then kids don't listen anyway. It's not like they didn't hear any other view. It's that they cared more about what their peers were saying than about what the people that actually had experience were saying. Again, as to what's going on, for me, it always comes down to this: did you have a reasonable alternative to not do this thing, right? So, someone says, well, someone was holding a gun to my head, and that's why I had to kill that person because if I didn't kill them, they would have killed me. It's like, that's a pretty good excuse. On the other hand, if your excuse is they would have made fun of me if I didn't do it, that is a terrible excuse. It wouldn't get you off in a war crime trial. Right, and a good reason too, right? It shouldn't get you off on a war crime trial. So anyway, I would say that if we think of this as something only that an outsider would say, then it's easy to dismiss it and say we're all to blame. But I say, look, it's not something that only an outsider would say. People who are embedded in the communities, who have had experience, they see it with their own eyes, and they don't take these same excuses. So why should we?
Bryan, further on that, you've kind of made the argument that there's also a move in both the left and the right to say, well, the elites are the source of my problems. And why don't you develop that a little bit as well?
So, first of all, it's a totally unconstructive attitude, even if it's true. Right? So it could very well be that elites have messed everything up for you. It's like, all right, well, so now what should you do? Should you go and take heroin because the elites are bad? That is a terrible response to that situation. My colleague Tyler Cowen has this parable about a banana subsidy. This is one where the government subsidizes bananas, and then people store piles of bananas on their roofs, and then the roofs collapse and they die. And it's like, if only the government had not passed the banana subsidy, they'd be alive. Yeah, but also, even with a banana subsidy, you probably shouldn't have been putting the bananas up on your roof. It's just not a good idea. Now, in terms of the extent to which elites really are to blame for things, I would say that you really need to take it case by case. For housing regulation, where I'm wrapping up a book on that, I think that elites are heavily to blame. Often they're local elites rather than national elites. But nevertheless, they are pillars of the community saying, oh, we couldn't possibly allow you to tear down this wonderful colonial house and replace it with a skyscraper little house, 1,000 people. That would just be a disaster. Right? That's more of an elite thing to worry about. In the case of immigration restrictions, which I write about a lot, I think that is not so much of an elite thing. I think elites tend to be on the side of more immigration. And that's where I will say, all right, well, the elites get some things right, some things wrong. So I guess that's where I would go with that.
Great, thanks. Speaking of elites, Chris, after smoking weed at school, Chris did a PhD in physics at Johns Hopkins and then worked as a bond trader on Wall Street for 20 years. And one of the things that you've said, Chris, and you can maybe talk a little bit about this, but you began to take these walks and you went to Hunts Point in the Bronx and you spent a lot of time there. And one of the things I've heard you say is the problem of poverty is really not so much the problem of the poor, it's the problem of the rich and the elites because of, in a sense, the things that we value. Now, you differ from Bryan on that. Do you want to maybe talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, going back to a point you said earlier, which was, it's not like they don't have these values in these communities, but those values are being eroded, and they're being eroded by the elites. Like, so if you look at like the kind of things that give people a sense, we replaced what I would call local regulation, family, place, church, with government regulation. And so when we decriminalize something like marijuana, or we legislate away kind of, make it easy divorces and all these things, we basically, when the government is the sole moral regulator, when you actually deregulate something and make it legal, that's a moral claim to many people in the working class. That's like, okay, it's okay now. It's no longer profane, it's sacred. So what you have in these communities is a real absence of regulation, self-regulation, that basically comes from the top down. And so what I would say to Bryan in some senses is I think I call it a justified cynicism within within these communities towards authority. It comes from the fact that everybody that's all their dealings with authority figures, and in that they see that's schools, that's guidance counselors, that's police, that's voting, that's the DMV, and it's mostly the legal system. Everything is negative. All their interactions with authority figures is basically being scolded, being wronged. You spend time in poor neighborhoods and you see how the interaction between police and kids go. It's not. I don't want to demonize the police because the police are in a no-win situation, but the judicial system crushes them. And it's something that they have. It's a soulless bureaucratic system filled with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors that gives them nothing but problems. So there's this real antagonism between the government and kind of the authority figures that breeds what I call a justified cynicism that leads in many cases. Again, I'm not saying they had bad experience with the judicial system, therefore it's okay to be an addict, but the path from there to there is understandable if all you've seen is systems that kind of degrade what you believe in, and that includes a lot of our economic policies, which you go into Northside Milwaukee, which has from 1940 to 1980, the black population went from about 100 people to about 20% of Milwaukee's population. They came for the jobs in the factories that were in the north side, and those factories produced a stable neighborhood because the father could go get a job. They used to say if you get fired from one place, you just walk across the street and go get another job, and it allowed them to put their economic house in order, so they then could put their family in order. And actually, when those factories started moving overseas, the deindustrialization, that completely crushed the neighborhood. And so into that vacuum came dysfunction and economic collapse, and then dysfunction. Families fell apart, and their whole source of identity was changed. And and so it was crushing to who they were as people. It took away their sense of meaning, and it left a vacuum. And one of the things I've talked about a lot is, I think it's hard for people to understand why some people use drugs. But if you walk into a drug trap at 2 a.m, or you walk into a crack house, it's a community. It's a welcoming community. Now, for all the viewers, don't do drugs. I'm not encouraging you to do it, but you understand that it's a place that people accept you as who you are, and you find a community. And what people want in life is a community, and that's where they're going to get it sometimes.
So I can tell, Bryan, you want to jump in here. But before you do, I'd like to maybe ask a question that challenges you a bit. Chris, how would you respond to this? In one sense, you make and again, put it into your own words, but you make, I think, a very important claim that a lot of what's happened in what Augusto Del Noce calls pure bourgeois, like the shift from Christian bourgeois, where the commerce has a place, but embedded in the larger concept of higher values and transcendent values, has left. Everything becomes transactional. And that we've ignored these transcendent values of place and family and race and communities. And so that we have this deep cultural problem. And yet, it also sounds like you're making almost an economistic argument that, well, if the factories hadn't closed, everything would have been fine. How would you respond to that critique?
I think, they're interchanged. You need economic stability at some level to allow yourself to build a functional society. And so what the old jobs did, at least in places like Northside or Gary, Indiana, was it allowed somebody without credentials to have enough economic stability. All they had to do was get out of high school, if that. You go to Battle Creek, Michigan. Battle Creek, Michigan is a perfect example. It was where they make Kellogg's. I remember talking to a couple in Battle Creek, Michigan, and the guy literally walked out of high school onto Kellogg's factory floor and had a job for 40 years. And that stability allowed him to build a life. And I remember talking to his wife, and she said, when I interview people, I ask them how old they are. And she's like, she was like 76. I'm like, you look really good for 70. She goes, well, I am. And she goes, I said something offhand. She goes, I'm glad I'm not any younger. I said, what do you mean? She goes, I wouldn't want to be a young person at this point. I see what my grandchildren face. Kellogg's is gone, Post is gone. They've downsized. And my kids are working jobs where they're running around gig to gig. And so they can't build, their grandkids are, and so they can't build that stable life. And for someone to actually say, I wouldn't want to be young again, meaning you're facing you're 76 years old, you're saying like, if I could take a pill, I wouldn't want to be 24 again. That's a damning statement for how things are. So I think you need the economic stability as kind of almost like a first principle. But after that, you also need, my biggest pushback against kind of the field that Bryan is in, and not necessarily Bryan here, but is I think that we look at things far too much in economic terms. We adjudicate decisions, policy, by is it going to increase the GDP, is it going to increase our efficiency, without looking at what I'd call the externalities, is how is the community going to be affected? How's a family going to be affected? And so I think when we look at policy a lot, we tend to look at things like non-economic things like, well, place doesn't matter much. If a factory is here or if a factory is here, it doesn't really matter. It matters a lot to the people in this town if the factory is here rather than here. It matters immensely. It matters so much. It's like removing one of their arms. If they 2 generations from Appalachia or 2 generations from Selma, Alabama, and you're telling now you have to move to New York City, that's part of their identity, and that's a big cost.
Yeah. And as you say, that's different from what you call the front row kids who are moving as a normal thing. Now, I studied debate moderation. I have a PhD.
Champion debate moderator?
I was a champion. I was.
He needs more time.
I was a champion debate moderator, and so I learned this technique when you have Dr. Bryan Caplan. You just go like this, Bryan.
A lot of the arguments that Chris makes seem plausible when he's telling them to you, but if you just imagine being in a dialogue with the person in the situation and being another person that knows them, I think they really just don't feel plausible at all. Just imagine that you were the mother of a teenager who is hanging out with a group of people that are using heroin, and you say, why are you doing this, son? He says, well, you have to understand, Mom, there's a great community, and I feel like I'm a part of it, and people need community. Would seem ridiculous. Say like, no, you don't. It's not a good community. It's a terrible place, and there's plenty of better options. I can tell you 5 right off the top of my head. And then if the teenager says, yeah, but I don't want to go to the church group. I don't want to go to the library group. I want to hang out with the cool kids doing drugs. That's where it's like, okay, so the first thing you said is really very little to do with what the actual problem is. It's more of you are being defiant and difficult and don't want to go and do the thing that makes sense because you're a difficult, impulsive young person, which is also not constructive, but it's true. So now, when we're thinking about how hard it is to be poor in America, I have written about immigration, and I am very fond of this argument, which is not popular, but it's still very deep. And that is, well, the immigrants seem to be doing fine. The immigrants go and cut ties to their community. They go to a totally new country. They might not know the language. And somehow they go and they find a job for themselves. They find a place for themselves. They raise their families. Their kids turn out well. Why can't you do the same thing? Now, again, this might not be the most constructive way of putting it, but in terms of understanding what's really happening, I think it's very illuminating. And it shows really like it's much more about personal virtue and or you could also say the family itself being important rather than this amorphous thing of the community, which is really just so broad and vague. I mean, honestly, so while it's true that people need people, the value that you get out of immediate family, close friends is so much higher than that of just I need to be in a society that's really friendly and supportive. If you just remember that the world has a lot of introverts who barely have any they just know a few people, and that's plenty for them. Right? So now, the introverts don't talk much. Right? They don't go and tell you their stories. They're not eager to say, hey, let me tell you one thing as an introvert. and then go on for 10 hours, but they are there. They're a large part of the population. So if you just look at them, you can see they don't seem to need community all that much. As long as they've got a few family members, 1 or 2 friends, they feel contentment. Now, for someone who's more extroverted, you may say it needs to be broader. But again, for someone who says, look, there's a problem in my community. It's a deep problem, and this is just totally hindering me. That's not only is it unconstructive, it's just not true. It says, well, why don't you go and try to find like 2 more friends? Wouldn't that take care of most of the problem? It's doable. And they don't have to be heroin addicts, actually. They could be friends with jobs who are conforming to the success sequence. Right? And then you could hang out with them, and that would be a big enrichment to your life. Why don't you try doing that? Again, that sounds kind of like being a scold, which Chris doesn't like. So I guess the right tone is different from the right point. There's the true thing to say, and then there's the right way of saying it. I'll confess, I've just specialized in trying to say the correct thing. All right, and I know I need to improve on saying it in the better way, although I also feel like there's a division of labor, and if I just say it like it is, then there'll be one of you will be listening and will say, okay, that's the way it is. Now how can I make what is palatable to others? And I will thank you, and I say, thank you so much for taking what I said, which was correct, but totally inert because people wouldn't listen, and getting people to listen.
I mean, I guess my thing is, as someone who spent a lot of time in these communities, I just have a lot more empathy with people and understand a lot better. I understand, I don't justify it. It's not a justification. It's not a moral approval of people who are surrounded by depressing situations, who are surrounded by limited options, who are being told directly and indirectly that they're losers because of their situation. I understand where people turn to different decisions than what Bryan may want them to do or I may want them to do. I think there's a and to the point of, their mother wouldn't speak to them the same way. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, there's not family members around. And I think one of the real issues here is that we've devalued the family to the point, I used to be a scientist, and so when I went into work in these communities, I didn't want to become a classic right-wing scold saying family, 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 family. But you go into these communities and within 2 weeks you're saying family, 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 family. You need strong functional families. And in a lot of these cases, we don't have strong functional families. And we can argue about why that is. But without the regulatory family, to have the mother tell the kid, don't do that. And so the only person telling them is a don't do drugs sign from an institution that they have no respect for because that institution has provided them with nothing before. Without the churches, to add a moral framework, I just don't see in this kind of what I would call a libertarian hellscape, where it's all about the economic and nothing about the communal, that you can expect people who, in a libertarian hellscape, that we actually are proud that we reward winners with more than they deserve and proud that the losers suffer. That you can't imagine that when you go to the bottom of the ladder that you're going to find people who are making reckless decisions. I think we've created a situation that we've created this ruthless meritocracy, so-called meritocracy, and there's only one ladder out, and that one ladder out is the educational system, and the educational system is stacked against them. I don't see where you can't have some empathy with the people who are at the bottom, who are told because with just enough hard work you can make it out. The flip side of that is if you're at the bottom, you're a loser and it's your fault. I just don't see how you can look at those people in the face and tell them that you just need to work a little harder. I just like some of the people I'm thinking about. If I had told them just to work a little bit harder, I would have felt like an asshole. Just point blank, because that's just they're in a trailer park in the middle of Appalachia, or they're a black kid in Gary, Indiana, surrounded with empty lots and barbed wire, and I'm supposed to tell them just to work a little harder.
So, Bryan, I'd like to move here to education in a minute, where you both actually
We agree on that one.
overview of agree on that one. But before we go to education, just besides the education part, do you want to give one more response to Chris's comment there? And then I'll restart us on education.
Sure. So I'd say that when we talk about empathy, it's worth remembering there's a lot of people in the world, and of course a lot of people in poor neighborhoods. You can say I have empathy for the drug addict or the alcoholic. How about empathy for the family of the drug addict or alcoholic? I'll say it. I definitely put myself in the shoes of that person first. Right, the shoes of a person where they're supposed to be taking care of their kids, and instead they're spending the family money on alcohol. And they say, look, what am I supposed to do? And what you're supposed to do is stop doing that. Right? It's a beverage, and we're your family, and we should come far before the beverage. So still, and you say, well, that's so easy for you to say. A lot of people do stop drinking. A lot of people do stop using drugs. It's not a pipe dream. It's something that happens routinely. I mean, it's actually very common just for people to age out of even very severe addictions, which it is a bit surprising, but true. There's a famous study of Vietnam War veterans who came home. They were heroin addicts, and almost all of them stopped using as soon as they got back to the US. It's like, yeah, well, now I got something else to do, so I guess I don't need to be an addict anymore. It is just surprising how strong the power of choice really is. Now again, just to go and say, well, in this hopeless situation, it makes sense that people would do this. Say it really does not make sense. I agree that just saying work a little bit harder is going to be totally unpersuasive. I mean, honestly, giving any kind of unsolicited advice of any kind to anyone is almost totally unpersuasive. You need to wait for the person to want your advice. Right, so people come to my office looking for advice all the time, and of course, not most of my students. Most of my students never come to my office, but the students that come, they want some advice, and I usually start by asking them some questions about what they want, like, well, what is your career goal anyway? And they tell me things, and I try to listen and say, okay, well, sometimes I say, like, wow, that career is so far from what I know, I don't know that I could help you. But other times they say, yeah, well, I want to learn to manage a textile factory in China. Will the PhD in economics help me? So he's like, yeah, no. No one here knows how to manage a textile factory in China. We would not be capable of assisting you in that. You should really look in a different place. So you do need to wait for a person to want some advice before advice is helpful. But I mean, I will say that I advise a lot of young people, and I think I do know useful things for almost everyone. I will say this is probably one of the things that being a dad has done more to me than anything else, which is just to convince me that I can help anyone if they will listen. Now, getting them to the point where they want to listen, that is difficult. But yeah, like if someone wanted to listen and they said, well, gee, I'm in a really distressing situation. This is a really bad neighborhood. I've got the barbed wire. It's scary. And I say, yeah, that sounds really terrible. But you know what will not work? Becoming a drunk. Becoming a drug addict is totally unhelpful for getting out of this situation. I guess I start with, like, well, do you want to be there forever? No. And I say, well, do you know anyone who's not in that situation? Almost everyone in that situation does actually have some relatives, sometimes close, sometimes distant. They're not in that situation. And you say, well, so what are they doing differently from what your family's doing? And they'll say, oh yeah, well, they did the following things. Say, well, emulate the people who have the job that you want to have. This is like my standard advice to anyone. Even if I don't really know much about the job, I will say, well, do you know, is there any, like, who are the people that have the job that you want one day? So, okay, talk to them. That's my advice to you. Stop talking to me, talk to them. And then I have some additional things like get people that are not that much older than you, because if you're 20 and you want to be a professor, don't talk to the 70-year-old professor. His advice is just out of date. But talk to the 20 to 28-year-old professor. He can probably tell you a lot about what's going on. How can I be like you? Reverse engineer it. This is useful advice. I'm not saying that if I just went to the people in Chris's book and said, hey, reverse engineer things, well, yeah, but they're not going to listen to me. It's still damn good advice. It's just if a person isn't ready to listen, then it won't work.
I think one of the other things that a lot of people underestimate is how fragile the tightrope is to walk in these neighborhoods to get out, to quote, get out. The judicial system, the educational system, all these things, and then the community itself, the peer pressure and things like that. If you slip up, it can be a very much easy cascade down. So you almost have to walk the perfect tightrope out, like this very, very narrow path to get out, and you have to be perfect all the time. And a lot of us are never perfect all the time. None of us are perfect all the time. So I remember when the New York City had this awful policy in the during the I guess it was Bloomberg era, It was a stop and frisk policy, which police would basically just, and I was around it often. So you just see, I was just walking through Hunts Point with a bunch of friends of mine who don't look anything like me. 3 cop cars pull up, grab them, throw them against the wall, frisk them, and I'm a smartass. And had anybody done that to me, I would have lost my cool in a second, because these kids didn't lose their cool. They couldn't lose their cool. They knew they couldn't lose their cool. If they lose their cool, then it's just a cascade down. If I woke up one day and I was kind of frustrated, annoyed, and a policeman came up and I remember when I remember taking a picture of one of the policemen doing this, and he said, "Stop." I said, "Actually, I have the right to do this." He goes, "No, you don't." And he says, "I'm going to charge you with if you take that picture, I'm going to arrest you." I said, "For what?" He goes, "Whatever I care to, I will. I'll just make something up." And I'm like, at the time I was like 48 or 50, and I was counting to 20 in my head. Don't lose it. Don't lose it. If I was like 18, I would have lost it. And so I think the idea that exercise self-control is wonderful, but you're tested. Your self-control is tested over and over and over, minute by minute. The neighborhood and the forces that kind of both from within the neighborhood and from outside the neighborhood, you're tested all the time. And I do know there are kids who follow Bryan's advice who do make it out. When I go into these communities, I spend time in like the community colleges, people who walk that tightrope, and they're wonderful kids. They're absolutely wonderful kids. I give them all the credit in the world. But it's easy not to be one of them, because they have to be perfect to get there. And I don't think few of us can be that perfect.
All right,
just real quick, and all this perfection stuff, that is a gross exaggeration of the truth. Standards in American high schools are really low. If you're in a high school in a bad area, like just showing up and trying to do the work, you're going to finish with almost certainty. And of course, there's plenty of colleges with very low standards that'll be happy to take you. You said you wanted to move on to the education system. The idea that we have a system that is totally unforgiving is almost the opposite of the truth. It's one where it's ultra forgiving. It's true you're not going to get into Harvard. And Harvard, you may very well have to be near perfection, especially if you are white or Asian. But nevertheless, the idea that normally you have to be perfect in America in order to avoid the worst outcome is just totally wrong.
Okay, so let's change direction. You talked about housing as a problem. So we've talked about the personal responsibility element. You've talked about then there are policies, Bryan, like how difficult it is to build, and this has doubled the cost and sometimes quadrupled the cost, I think, right, of housing, which of course affects the poor. A couple of other areas are the criminal justice system. So maybe we just spend a short time on the criminal justice system because you brought it up, and then we'll go to education. Anthony Bradley, who is a colleague here at the Acton Institute and a professor at King's College in New York City, wrote a book on overcriminalization. And he responded to, I think it's Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow. And he said, she had argued basically that policing was racist. And Anthony said, started doing the studies, and he said, well, actually, it's not racist. It's really based on poverty. We over-criminalize and we over-police the poor. And this is another obstacle. So let's begin, maybe, Bryan, what do you think about that argument? Do you think that holds? Like housing, there are institutional pressures that are maybe unjust or unfair to the poor, like housing would be one, right? Because if you're wealthy, okay, it's fine. How do you respond to that? And then Chris.
I mean, what Chris was saying about the police being damned if they do or damned if they don't is relevant here, because if the police were to say, all right, fine, we're not going to go into poor neighborhoods, people would not say, oh, great, thanks. Instead, they'd be complaining, well, apparently you don't care about the well-being of poor crime victims. The problem is that most crime is intra-group, which means that if you are in a poor neighborhood, you are protecting poor victims from poor criminals. Of course, in the real world, there's also a bunch of innocent people who wind up getting caught in the crossfire both ways, both getting arrested even though they were doing nothing wrong, as well as, of course, getting hurt when they were not involved in crimes. So, I mean, I would generally just focus on things that should not be crimes at all. Say that's where we really should focus, rather than yes. So I've long been an advocate of drug legalization. I think that it has a lot. It is a good idea. It's one that people often have a hard time swallowing. Say, well, fine, it could work for marijuana, but what about other things? There isn't time to go into the full argument for it, but I think that the analogy with alcohol prohibition is very strong and really worth taking seriously. So that would be probably the biggest one that I'd be thinking about.
Okay, Chris, let's go quick through this because I want a couple other topics. I know it's super complex, so I'm asking you to do really hard things quickly.
Okay,
And can you explain to us the Big Bang when we're done? He actually did study the Big Bang. That's not a joke.
It's a Bible dressed up in math. Genesis dressed up in math.
Genesis and math. Okay, that's your Twitter answer. Okay, yes, sir.
In terms of, I think the focus on the cops being bad is a mistake. It's the judicial system that's bad. The cops are in an awful situation, as Bryan said. Damned if they do, damned if they don't. I think they're being asked to regulate, to deal with situations that should be dealt locally, but aren't being dealt locally by the family, by the community. I think I would disagree with Bryan in the sense that I think if you believe that these communities, I understand Bryan believes that these communities are filled, poverty is a lot about lack of self-control. Why would you legalize drug in a community with people who lack self-control? I think that's going to cause chaos. I don't believe addiction is about necessarily just about a lack of self-control, but I do believe if the government is a sole arbiter of what is legal, of moral, acts as the sole arbiter of what's moral, then once you decriminalize something, you actually approve its use. And I think that's very dangerous in this community, is to take away any stigma about using drugs. I think drugs should have a stigma associated to using them. That's kind of the community way of controlling the behavior, making it harder to do what I said people often do.
So I know a lot.
I think, did I get it all?
Yeah, no, I don't know. Did you want to say one more and pretty quick thing just about, like you've talked before, about how you think that, how did you explain it? That oftentimes wealthy people will just get away with things that poor people don't.
I just think that the quip I used to say is that, and I do agree with Bryan that the system is stacked against the poor, not just it's not a racial situation. It's much more about class. Or
Anthony Bradley.
Yeah, it's much more about class. I mean, but in terms of again, it's both a kind of a economic plus a cultural issue, which is just there's a lot like. I used to say that rich people make mistakes, poor people go to jail. Give me the person, I can find the crime. The libertarian view, I believe, is that we have way too many laws and regulations which affect poor people. And so a policeman can always find something they did wrong. And when that happens, that cascades into usually the criminal courts far more than it does for wealthy people.
All right, so once Chris said the libertarian view is right, Bryan finally nodded, and let's move into other areas of agreement, and that is education. So, Chris, you've written about like how the back row and the front row, and that really the educational system is stacked against the poor. And Bryan, you have made the case against education. You think it's just a waste. For unless you maybe make it into a certain elite area, it's more of a signal than it is anything else. So why don't you make the case against education, and then Chris, how you can talk about how you see that, especially impacting poverty. And both of you speaking about poverty, especially.
So in slogan form, most of us think about education as being kind of job training. Of course, economists think of it that way, but also parents, teachers, politicians. We think about schools as places where you go and we take immature children and we turn them into hardworking, able-bodied adults. Right? And I say it's, while we think of education as being job training, it's much more of a passport to the real training, which happens on the job. It's a passport to the real training that happens on the job. What's going on, I say, is you definitely learn some useful skills in school, but just not that much. Most of what you study, predictably, you will never need to know after the exam. But it still makes sense, given that we have this ranking system for employers to say, well, I've got 300 applicants. I might as well throw away 270 from people with the weaker credentials. Even if you were to say, well, aren't there going to be some good people in the 270? Yeah, but I'd have to interview all 270 to find those good people in that group. Whereas if I go and limit myself to the well-credentialed people, then I am going to spend a lot less time trying to find out, spend a lot less time in fruitless interviews. So I think a lot of what's going on with the education system, I'd say a majority of it really, the main reason why education pays is that we have a system where you go to school and you get a stamp on your forehead. Now, what's the problem with this? From the point of view of the individual, it really doesn't matter. Remember I was talking about finish high school? This is advice to an individual. Now, this does not mean that if we would just get everyone to finish high school, then we would solve our problems. Rather, what it means is that if everyone had finished high school, employers would then raise their expectations about how much education you need to be worthy of not having your application thrown in the trash. This is what's called the problem of credential inflation. There's overwhelming evidence that there's been massive credential inflation over the last century. Basically, the job that you have probably could have been obtained by your parents or grandparents with years less education. Right? There are a few jobs that have spread, that become common, that do require more years of training, like in tech. But most jobs are not like that. Rather, for most jobs, it's just that to be in the running, you need more degrees because other people have more degrees. For society, this is very destructive and wasteful. Really simple way of thinking about it is this. Would you rather be a high school dropout today, when it's like the bottom 15% of educational attainment, or a high school dropout in 1945, when that would put you in the bottom 80%? Right, so I guess it would be like 75%. So yeah, like in 1945, only about 25% of Americans had finished high school. So the stigma against someone who hadn't finished high school was very small, which meant that there were lots of job opportunities for you. Of course, we generally think about our system as being great for the poor because if there is a highly talented poor student, we roll out the red carpet for them, and we really do. But what about the siblings of that highly talented poor student? They are dealing with a system where they're not likely to get the degrees, and then opportunities they would have had just to prove themselves by working on the job and moving up are just much less than before. So I think we have the system where we've created a system where there's a lot of social pressure to get an enormous amount of education. For most people, it's super boring and pointless. If you just say, yeah, well, super boring and pointless intellectually and practically, but socially it's very useful because it's the way that you get a good job. So, all right, well, thanks a lot. I'm 13. I don't really feel like doing another 9 years of drudgery in order to get this better job after graduation. Also, of course, we have greatly devalued vocational education of all kinds. You probably heard of in Germany and Switzerland, at that age, there's a test, and if you don't look like you are going to become, that you are academically very gifted, then they try to train you to be a mechanic or to be a plumber or an electrician, which really bothers Americans. Like, you're giving up on that kid. Right? So the chapter on vocational education in my book is called One is Greater Than Zero. The meaning is it is better to prepare a person for one practical job than 0 practical jobs. Preparing a kid that does not like school to be a professor is just ridiculous, right? And again, if there's a kid who dreams of being a professional athlete, but he's mediocre, all right, when he's 6, you humor him and say, yeah, you're going to be the next most valuable player. But if there's a kid who's 16 and he can't even get on his high school baseball team, it is cruel to keep telling him, oh, you're so great, you're going to become a professional baseball player. There is a point where you just have to be honest and say, all right, maybe there's like a 1 in a million chance that things could turn around for you, but if that doesn't happen, how about we think about your plan B? And yet, while we'll do this for athletics, we really don't want to do it for academics, and we should.
Chris?
I mean, I can almost agree with completely all that.
All right.
I would say that I would probably be a little bit even harsher on the system. I think what we do is, in my book I write about, I think the largest division in the United States is not class, it's not race, it's education. And so that's why I come up with the front row, back row idea. And you're seeing that now in how we vote and things like that.
And you can see it very strongly in marriage. So the classic sociologist measure of whether two groups are the same or separate is whether it causes social dysfunction or social angst if they intermarry. So you really can see the intermarriage rates between people with bachelor's degrees and people without are super low.
So
right? It is like a caste.
Yeah, it very much is. And so in my book, I argue that the greatest division in the country is education. That's where the front row, back row metaphor comes from. And the front row is basically me, everybody up here, actually. But it's people who have lots and lots of credentials. And one of the things I've always find frustrating is some people did books similar to mine, because who were focused on talking about my book. In many ways, was focusing on the opioid addiction, the addiction issue, and so I get sent other versions of that book by other people. And one of the things I find very frustrating is the solutions that are proposed in every other book is we need to make these people like us. We need to give them education. They need to go to, they need more and more education, more education, more education, more education. I'm like, no. The problem is that we have
the addicts themselves.
No.
Okay, the kids before the problem starts.
Yeah.
Not so crazy.
Like Nick Kristof says, the way to solve this problem is they need to be more like us. We need to prepare them to be op-ed writers. They need to prepare them to be lawyers. And like, no, absolutely not. What you need to do is understand that we need to provide alternative ways of living a meaningful life that don't require college. Not everybody is a college-bound person. Not everybody has the aptitude or necessarily the interest in being in college. They may not have the, in Bryan's case, I think it's just, the idea that self-control, whatever you want to call it, they don't particularly have that in them. They don't want to be that person. And we've kind of built this kind of just oppressive system that funnels everybody into this one-size-fit-all college-bound system, where you should feel guilty if you don't like Shakespeare. I don't like Shakespeare. Like, why does everybody have to feel guilty for not liking Shakespeare? I mean, I think it's
not even Titus Andronicus.
It's just this weird language, man. Like, I don't want to weird it. Like, so but like we funnel everybody into this one kind of one-size-fit-all concept. And that's being done by the case system, by the people who at the top who can't imagine a success that doesn't include what they did. What do you mean? I became the geography B captain of my school, and then I went off to, blah, 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 debate team. But you know what? There's a lot of people who that's just not who they are.
Do you think that negatively affects boys even more? Because that seems to be a real problem. Like boys, especially with like later development and a host of things. So
I mean, there are those people in those communities who are going to come up and become professors. And that's great. And when I meet them, I tell them, you go for it, and you do that. But it's the other people who are made to feel like losers if they don't pursue that path. And so I think, the trade school thing is huge to me, and because. There's almost this meme on Twitter, because when I do talk about the biggest division being education, I inevitably get the professor of philosophy who's adjuncting in New Orleans who says, well, I'm working class because I only make $30,000 a year. And I'm like, you have so much cultural capital, man. You have all these options. You chose this path.
You can still marry a lawyer and no one will say, heaven forfend.
So the people quote in the back row, and seeking respect is kind of they know they are felt, they are considered a second class, and you have to. And so what I was saying is the trade schools is. That person will get mad that the plumber makes $120,000. And you would think that somebody would say, being a plumber is the right decision.
So I'm going to get to questions from the audience, but I have, Chris has a great line that I'm selling his book here. He has a great line. He says, I went to Huntsville, the Bronx, an atheist and a vegetarian, and I came out going to church and eating McDonald's. And one of the things that you talk a lot about is faith. And so you have 30 seconds to tell us. You have 30 seconds to tell us about that sense of like what your experience, or I'll give you a minute on that distinction, how you kind of came in and what changed you of seeing it as like, almost like the opiate of the people or a functional thing to something that mattered, and why.
Yeah, I mean, I walked in, I used to be a scientist, I said, and so when I walked in and I saw that I went into these communities where I thought there would be no faith because these people are suffering from the worst, and I found immense faith. And so my first reaction was, faith is important. It's kind of like the crutch that they need. And then over time, I realized that how condescending a view that was. What in fact was happening was these were people who were living lives that put them in some senses closer to the evidence for God, because they understood mortality in a way that I think wealthy people don't understand. We who are wealthy, we who are very educated, have a hubris that we can solve anything, including living longer. So we eat right, we do all these things, and we can live longer. But people who live in rough situations, I think, are closer to the evidence for God, because they understand that in many cases, being a human is about being a true human is being about being humble and knowing that we don't have it under control and we can't solve everything. And so I now say that basically the reason there are faith in these communities is not as a kind of a pragmatic solution that they need to a crutch, but because in many ways that we, the wealthy ones who are living lives that hide us from the evidence for faith and evidence for God.
Okay, by the way, so real quick on housing regulation, not only can we get the price of housing way down, but guess who's going to build that housing? It's going to be almost all non-college males. This is meaningful work. It's the kind of work that it's similar to working in a factory. In ways, actually maybe better, because you actually get to see that you have constructed this thing. So, and remember, this is an enormous industry already. So if we could just double this industry, it would make an enormous difference in terms of providing a economically sustainable, realistic economic alternative, whereas protectionism is really just about reviving some industries that have died anyway and where we can just get it cheaper. But for housing, on the other hand, is something that we totally need, totally can do. So it is just such a missed opportunity. Or it will be until my book comes out and changes everything. Right?
All right. As a professional moderator, 15 seconds.
So what I would say to that is people talk way too much about the dignity of work. The only place where you actually get dignity of work is when it's a craft, when it's something that you actually where you are in control of the process. And that includes things like carpentry, that includes things like auto work, that includes things, that is not working sales necessarily. And people who work sales, look, God bless them. It's hard work. What I'm saying is dignity of work comes from someplace where you actually are involved in the process of making that. That becomes who you are, and that's generally craft work.
Okay, so there's one more debate I wanted to get to, which is free trade. But we don't have time because we have some questions. So why don't we start with the question from the audience? And there's the question. Who has the mic? Okay, all right. Well, that mic is getting passed around. Raise your hand if you have a question from the audience. We'll get you a mic. And here's a question from some of our online viewers. Is there a way out of poverty that doesn't include moving out of low-resourced communities? Bryan?
I mean, there's definitely a way. There's so many different things you can do. I would definitely say that moving away is one of the most obvious things to do. Say, like, where are there jobs that you want to do that are out there? If they say, like, I really absolutely have to stay here, then I guess the next question would be, all right, so who in this community do you know who has the job closest to what you want, and talk to them and find out how they did it.
Question. Oh, thank you. I first of all, I just really enjoyed your back and forth debate from very different perspectives on such a challenging issue, so thank you for that. One fact that's I want to bring up and see if you guys respond to was that in that local area, I think of Native American communities or others where I've read and seen in research that the most predictive element of being impoverished is your zip code. Mm-hmm. So then you have to stay in that community. For people in that community, there is no way out. How do you explain that if you're just saying it's more of a choice?
I guess I would say that if there's a poor zip code, the people that want to go and get out are probably going to leave the zip code, and then they won't be in the zip code anymore. It doesn't show that there's no possibility. It would say that you've got to be flexible. Sometimes I have a student who says, look, I really want to get a better job. I need to be a professor of geothermal dynamics, and it has to be in the DC area. And that's like, okay, that's going to be a tall order. If you want something that specific, then there's probably not going to be a lot of opportunities like that. So yeah, always start with cast a broad net. If there's something that's a deal breaker for you, then we'll have to work with that. But I would say that if someone really wants to stay in a very specific community with very low opportunities, then yeah, their options are going to be poor. Although even there, I would always say, all right, let's figure out the best thing that you've got right here. And again, the best thing normally is to ask the person himself and say, well, who are the people that you personally have seen that have the job that you want to get? And also make sure they're not that old, right? You don't want to get someone who's so old that their experience is irrelevant. And then say, let's loop them in on this conversation, or maybe it's like I'll pass you off to that person because all I can do is tell you that I'm not the right person to talk to.
All right, Chris, we're almost done. Your final comment?
What would be the question?
On this question about moving and like Native American communities, this zip code being kind of this limiting thing. It does have to be fast. I'm sorry, because I think we could go another hour with these gentlemen. But
I mean, I think that I think it's bad policy if we're asking people to be economic immigrants in their own country. I think that's just like I think we've built a country that I don't think is the right way.
Okay. This, of course, leads us now.
It always was that way, though. The U.S. has always been a place for people moving around. That's the whole way the frontier gets settled, is people saying, hey, things aren't that good here. Is there something else better someplace else? It's not the end of the world to have to move, right? I mean, like some people don't mind at all. Some people actually like it. I mean, like, first question is, well, do you even like this area of the country? No? Well, guess what? I got good news for you. There's other places that you probably like better. Let's find one you like.
All right. So I'm sorry. I wish we could keep going, but I have 28 seconds left. And so thank you very much. If you want to stay here, if we can convince them to stay, to the people who are here in person, I think maybe they could take more questions. But to those watching online, thank you very much for taking the time to join us for the Poverty Cure 2022 Poverty Cure Summit. Next one is 2024. And please come to acton.org, povertycure.org, and look at Acton On Demand. We have a lot of information where you can watch those things. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
If we stay up here, can I?
But still, if you were to go and give advice, probably you'd give advice very similar to follow the path that kid did, which is go to at the homeless shelter, go and try to be a model resident. To say sincerely, I'm really interested in getting a job. I'll take anything. Save your money. Of course, don't spend it on alcohol and drugs. And then his whole story is step one is he went and just bought a second suit of clothes at the dollar store so he could do job interviews for better jobs, and then just tried working his way up from there. It's much easier to get a better job once you have a job at all. One thing that I wanted to push back on a little bit, it's true that a lot of people get meaning from the craft of work, but even more universal from that is they're getting meaning from being part of a work community. When we think about community, normally it's some kind of nonprofit thing. A lot of people actually, their job is their main social outlet.
That's right.
Right, and it could be sales, it could be anything at all.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so people who win the lottery, most of them do not quit their jobs and stop working, even if they win big, they don't have to. And the main reason that people who do win the lottery do quit is just because people don't treat them the same anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken pictures of and stories of people who are in their 80s who are still working at McDonald's, and they don't need to. It's just they unretired, so they could have the community.
Yeah, like during COVID, I was actually thinking maybe I should become like a Walmart creator, like anything to get out of this horrible isolation. And I said maybe I'll get a book out of it. I didn't do it, but still, it did occur to me.
You'd be a good Walmart greeter, actually. You really would.
That's right.
Except my feet would hurt so much.
That's right. We have one more question here.
You'd be a good Walmart greeter.
You would be.
Somehow I don't think Bryan got to express everything he wanted to do on housing. I saw him 3 times try and put it in. And I was thinking about that too, as far as housing and community. I've seen it done obscenely and excessively in places like Africa, where a community just doesn't make sense anymore, and they'll bulldoze it. And on the pretense of a cholera outbreak or violence or political unrest or whatever, they'll get rid of it. On the other hand, I've seen in South Africa where they have propped up places that are filled with cholera and violence, and as a political expression, electrify it and therefore institutionalize the community as permanent when it probably should have been bulldozed. So my question is this: we've talked about today obsolescence of programs and obsolescence of initiatives. Is there should we call it on some communities and just say, we need to pull the plug on this community and allow the people to scatter? And I know you've always expressed yourself a little bit.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, I was wanting to hear how you would say it.
So I'll use the example of Lewiston, Maine, and this I'll give a talking point for him on this to some degree. Is the center of Lewiston, Maine was empty. In 1990, one family was moved in by Catholic Charities. I believe they're from Togo, and then by 2005, 2006, there were maybe 10% of the population in Lewiston, Maine was Somali immigrants who had self-immigrated there. They were originally placed in Minneapolis and then Atlanta, and they wanted to be in a better school district, so they went to Lewiston, and so it became this chain migration, where downtown Lewiston is now a vibrant, healthy community filled with Somali immigrants. So I think, and I've seen that across the country. Utica, New York has a lot of Bosnians. You can actually, the place where immigration works the best in the U.S. in my mind is where you have kind of that targeted immigration into these, almost any downtown now in the South or any agriculture thing has I used to say that the only things that are open in some of these communities are McDonald's and churches on Wednesdays and Sundays. But it's also Mexican American businesses, Mexican American restaurants. The kind of single family run business in many small southern towns is a Mexican American restaurant. They're the entrepreneurial class. So I think in a lot of these places, the solution to it is immigration.
Amen.
Okay, I think 10 minutes. We have one more. Okay, one more question. You want to get him worked up? Ask him about free trade.
Yeah, I'm going to be more self-serving. Two questions. One is, you mentioned how there's a difference between how this affects boys and girls in this kind of educational, hierarchical kind of system. And so I just covet your comments on a little more, maybe elaborate on why that is and what you think. And then this more self-serving question is, how you've also mentioned faith, Chris especially, in how this plays out and how churches are, and we've talked about this earlier today, how churches can be engines of society and moralization and have positive, but besides just proclaiming the gospel, also tangible worldly benefits. And I'd covet your comments also on that. Thank you.
Okay, you want to go first on?
Right. So in boys versus girls, you may have heard there's some differences, and some of the main differences is
it's not constructive.
Well, it could be. No, I think it is. So boys dislike sitting still more on average. Not every single one. I love sitting still. Sitting still is one of my favorite things to do, but people are always trying to stop me from sitting still when I want to make me not do it. But boys are less interested in sitting still, more want to go and build things, are less interested in just listening to somebody talk, and of course are more violent on average. Most boys are not very violent, but some are. So we have a system where boys who fit that profile really are in a tough spot, and there isn't really much of an alternative for them. So, some of the most heartfelt emails that I got about my education book were from teachers who would email me and say, I teach the vocational education at my school. I'm the only one who actually offers something to kids that don't like school, almost all boys. And when I leave, they're going to shut down my program. All right, so these are some of the best programs overall, especially when and they seem to work well, even when you're not really adjusting for the fact that that these are the kids that otherwise you'd expect poor outcomes from. And when you realize what that counterfactual is, then it looks even better than that. In terms of the community from churches and so on, I've worked on this a bit just for fun. When you go and do research on religiosity, there's two different kinds of measures. There's doctrinal measures and there's behavioral measures. So do you believe in angels versus how often do you attend church? The predictive value of these two kinds of measures varies a lot, but in terms of things like happiness, it seems like it's just the participatory measures that matter. You could be a Unitarian who believes in nothing, but as long as you show up and hang out with other people who believe in nothing, you're happy. On the other hand, you could be the lone biblical scholar who knows the book forwards and backwards, but if you don't know anyone that's interested in this or talk to anyone about it, then you don't get this happiness benefit from it. So I would say that all this says is, it's a good idea to be open-minded about, people need to be involved in something, but at least for their own happiness, if not for their own souls, it doesn't matter that much what the doctrines are as long as they can do something and see other people, which again is another reason I think that our COVID response was so terrible and inhuman, was just saying, look, the most important thing is reducing your risk of death down to a microscopic level. The fact that you're in a living hell, well, that's no big deal, just watch more Netflix.
Yeah, I mean, the bumper sticker I used to always say is, take-home lesson from my book. I'm not a policy person. I leave that to others. But I've always said that ultimately people want to be a valued member of something larger than themselves, and that community is even better if it provides kind of a metaphysical, transcendent experience, gives them a reason for living, an explanation. So I'm a huge fan of religion. I think it's ultimately, if pushed up against a wall, gun to head, say, like, what's your solution? I think we need more faith in this country. We need more faith. I think what my book in some senses is meant to be is kind of saying, look, it's kind of describing the aquarium we all live in and saying the water here is dirty. We got to change the water. And I mean, I don't know that necessarily how you change that, but I think faith is central to that.
You don't think the water is economic policy?
I believe that the economic policy has created, someone who reviewed my book said it better than I wrote, which is always annoying, that policy hasn't been conducive to forming communities. We've created policy that's not been conducive to forming kind of naturalized forms of communities. And I think it's been a stiff wind against, it's not necessarily entirely destructive, but it's made it harder to do these things. And, the kind of we live in the bathwater, to kind of be glib about it, the bathwater, the aquarium water, to be kind of glib about it, is basically secular materialism, is positivism. And I think, positivism is great at producing goods, great at producing, secular materialism is great at producing lots of TVs, is bad at producing lots of happiness and a lot of friends.
Right, and I would say that this emphasis on community isn't quite right. Friendship, family, right? So a person can be super happy if they've got one or two close people in their lives, even if they don't have a big community. And so I would say, rather than faith, I would just push friendliness, just being friendly to people. This is something that I think we've lost much more than faith. Maybe we never had it, but in any case, this is like whenever I am interacting with anyone on social media or in real life, just to give people the benefit of the doubt, assume that good things will happen. I always tell my kids, stop thinking about what could go wrong, think about what could go right. Yes, probably that person doesn't want to be your friend, but maybe they do, and if they do, that's going to be fantastic, so give it a try, and if it doesn't work, try again. I think that actually is more constructive advice and gets more to the point of actually improving lives than saying find a community, which I think is just sort of too big of a job and just too vague. Just saying, hey, find one new friend. All right, you can do that. Try it.
So everyone who knows me knows that the intense discipline that I've had to exercise not to start talking about the goodness of being and all the embedded things that I think Bryan's taking for granted. And how complex these things are. But I think that this is a very interesting debate because this question of the aquarium, what is in the water? And there's a lot of things in the water. And I think that, in fact, one of the things I liked about this debate is that not only was there energy and good elements, but that it really does open up a lot of questions, both in the economic side and how to think about things. I think personal responsibility and how we think about that. I think we're sometimes afraid to talk about personal responsibility. I think it's really important. And also to talk about really some of these, what I call the invisible elements that we ignore, we take for granted, these deep levels of embedded complexity. I mean, I always give the example right now where we're communicating in a place that's held up by rebar, there's electricity working, we just had some coffee, we're using an inherited cultural artifact called English, and we just it's there. And I think one of the things that this debate and discussion did, I think, is both highlights some of the difficulties, some of the complexities, some of the disagreements, and I think opens up the door to us to think about what are the invisible sources of order that we oftentimes ignore. But I really want to thank Bryan and Chris, because one of the things that's really important for me and for the Acton Institute is this is Bryan's point, right? I mean, we have to be friendly, and I get to listen to them and talk to them, and debate with them, and it's been just. Chris and I have talked several times. Bryan, this is the first time we've really done anything together, but it's great because we need to have lots of discussion, lots of debate, and poverty is a very complex issue. Economics are complex, societies, culture, religion, these are deeply complex things. And I think one of the ways is to be, in a sense, dialogical, in the sense not that we just kind of get along, but that we actually debate, we take things seriously, we learn from one another, and avoid the kind of, just critiquing and writing people off. So I'm really grateful to Chris and to Bryan for being willing to come up here, have a debate, have a good discussion. Thank you all for coming. And I have a message I have to give all of you who are here. So this is Poverty Cure, which is a 6-part DVD series that's for Christian audiences. And this is Poverty Inc., which is a 90-minute full-length film for general audiences, and we're very delighted about the response of this film. We've played it at over 60 film festivals. Michael Moore said it would change the way you think about third world poverty forever. Russ Roberts and Michael Moore both liked the film, right. So we are happy. Wow. Ron Paul's people tweeted it.
That's a weird Venn diagram.
Yeah, Ron Paul's people tweeted it, and Bernie Sanders people tweeted it. Democrats told Republicans they should watch it. Republicans told Democrats they should watch it. So we were.
Gee, what does it say?
So we were delighted for the response. But so we actually have copies. So any of you who live in the 1990s, we have DVDs for you in the back. You're welcome to take them and watch them. You can also get this, both of them on Amazon, and this is also on iTunes. It's not on Netflix anymore. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to come to this. And let's thank Bryan and Chris for a really interesting debate.